Okay, calm down.
I've had people who are intelligent but have a blind spot on this issue, but are otherwise intelligent, say to me, well, there's violence, talking about what Hamas did or Hamas allegedly did. And then there's bombs, like really openly embracing a qualitative difference between the two and
Yeah.
suggesting that one side is civilized and using modern technology and the other side is barbaric.
Those are people who don't pay much attention to international humanitarian law as it
Oh, yeah.
developed
No, right.
over the
Exactly.
20th century and especially after World War II. Before that, if you bombed a native population, uh, as the British and the Italians and the French did, um, that wasn't a war crime. You boasted about it. I mean, Churchill and Bomber Harris, the guy who bombs Germany for Britain during World War II, he's in charge of the bomber command. He got his wings bombing Iraqi civilians. And if you don't see that as terrorism or whatever, then you have not just a moral blind spot, but given things like the Genocide Convention and the developments of international humanitarian law since World War II, you don't understand the law. You don't understand that there shouldn't just be moral constraints on any violence, disproportionate and unjustifiable violence against civilians, but the specific violence of the state has to be seen in terms of law. Israel is desperate to show that what it does is both proportional and fits within those parameters. And I think almost anybody looking at the death toll and the number of civilians killed would argue that it's not.
Right.
We'll see what the legal judgments eventually are. But I think that in the view of most unprejudiced people and most unprejudiced public opinion, they've come to a conclusion about this. Just too many civilians have been killed for this to be immorally or legally justified.
Right. You will still see some people writing this out on Twitter, and I'm just thinking about a person, he's not like hugely influential, but he's been on MSNBC actually saying that Israel doesn't target civilians.
Well, those are people who haven't really looked at the counterinsurgency doctrine from which Israel's military doctrine evolves.
Right. Right. Exactly.
You go back and look at how the British ruled. They didn't just go after the militants. They went after the populations that they saw supported the militants. That's what the British taught the guys in the Haganah and the Palmach, who become the generals of what becomes the Israeli quote-unquote defense forces. Yigal Allon was taught these things. Yitzhak Sadeh was taught these things. Moshe Dayan was taught these things. That's how the British operated. Look what they did in Kenya. Look what they did in Malaya. Look what they did in Aden. They bombed civilian populations.
Yeah.
That's the way they ruled. And that's what they taught the Israelis. And that's what the Israelis did. Look at what they did in Gaza once they captured Gaza in 1956. They lined up the men and they shot them. They didn't interrogate. They just shot them by the hundreds. That's what Israel has always done. It attacked civilians in order to punish host countries for hosting militants. It often didn't even pretend to be after militants. Today they say, we have a Hamas target, we'll kill 1,000 or 200 or 100 people to kill this Hamas militant. And if he's much more important, we kill 2,000. If he's less important, well, they even, if you read the Israeli press, talk about this openly. They are, and their history has shown that they have done this. And that's not unique to Israel. It's what colonial powers do to indigenous peoples. Have always done.
They're just slightly
look at the American West. Look at Ireland. I mean, there's a long history here.
What do you say to people? I'm sure you've encountered this. People who say, yeah, but look at how the United States was founded. All countries are founded this way. That's just the way nations are born. Should we give the land back to Native Americans? Are you ready to leave, give up your home? What's your response to that?
First of all, European overseas settler colonial projects are different than the formation of nations. I mean, you can talk about how France was formed, and you can talk about the Cathars being liquidated and Protestants being liquidated by a Catholic state. It's not really the same thing as European overseas colonial settler projects, where you go into South Africa and you eliminate or subjugate the natives, or you go into Algeria and you eliminate or subjugate the natives, or you go into North America or Australia or Canada. So the formation of nations involves violence. Some of that violence is ethnic. It can be horrific, but it's completely different than overseas European settler colonialism. And regular European colonialism was different from settler colonialism. The British didn't do that in Egypt or in India. The French didn't do that in Morocco or Tunisia. The clearing people off the land, stealing their land, settling Europeans there. That's a specific kind of project, settler colonialism. That's the first thing. The second thing is the United States is a settler colonial project. I think it's past due that we recognize that. And we recognize the harm that was done to the indigenous population, and that we do what can be done as reparations for that harm. I don't think that should be such a radical idea. That should be true in Canada. That should be true. It's something that's a principle already in South Africa. It's something that the Irish are working towards in Northern Ireland, and I don't see why it's so hard to argue that for Palestine, Israel, or so hard to argue that for North America or Australia or New Zealand or any other successful settler colony. You're not going to. There is now there's a nation, there's a people that's been created in all of these places. The failed, the failed attempts. There's no North African French people in Algeria. That's gone. That's finished. But you do have a population in, for example, Northern Ireland, which has a distinct identity, and that has to be accepted. And that's now been accepted by the Irish state, by Ireland, and by Northern Irish Catholics. They've accepted a process whereby these people have their own identity and have their rights and so on and so forth. And that's happened also in South Africa. So there are ways of doing this that both recognize historic harm that's done and provide for reparation for that harm to the extent possible. And you have to remember, what happened in North America is fundamentally different from what happened in Ireland or what's happening in Palestine. You have a population, huge populations in both cases. In North America, they destroyed the indigenous population to a very large extent, and in Australia and in New Zealand. Those are four anomalies, as it were. In other settler colonial, you still have white settlers in Kenya. You still have white settlers in Zimbabwe. You still have white settlers in South Africa who are integrated into those societies on a basis, presumably, of equality. And that can happen, but through a process of recognition of history and reparations and reconciliation.
Yeah, these are people who never care about indigenous populations, and all of a sudden, because of this, they become advocates for First Nations people.
Yeah, well,
It's so cynical and gross.